And so what happens is if you have a religious reason to get people together and then you start to tell them how to vote or have, what causes to support, that creates a political momentum where then you begin to sort of shift and you combine government and you move towards a theocracy. And that's obviously really dangerous, and that's what our founders didn't want to let happen. And that's why they put up the separation of church and state as an important wall between. But now we have this pressure that's coming from the executive branch of government. We see it happening in the legislative branch of government, and depending on what happens with this and subsequent nominations, we have a real danger that it could be happening in the judicial branch.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to What's at Stake, a discussion about secular issues associated with civil liberties and civil rights. And this is especially timely given the events of next month, which is a critical juncture for Massachusetts and for the nation at large. My name is Sohan D'Souza. I'm the president of the Secular Society at MIT. And I'm really proud to have such an amazing panel here. I mean, these are organizations that have, the panelists represent organizations that have stood guard over civil rights and civil liberties, and including separation of church and state, separation of religion and state generally in the United States for many years. And we're very proud to present this panel. So I'll start by a little brief introduction for each panelist, and they will speak about, for a few minutes, about what taking stock of the situation of secularism in Massachusetts and in the US. So start with Carol Rose. Carol Rose is the executive director.
Carol Rose is the executive director of the ACLU of Massachusetts. Carol started her career as a reporter working for UPI, the New York Times, and others, doing numerous stints from DC to Pakistan to Vietnam. Upon her return to the US, she attended Harvard Law School, clerked for a federal district court judge, Patty Cyrus, and spent 6 years as a First Amendment intellectual property and civil rights lawyer at the Boston law firm of Hill & Barlow, before taking the helm at the ACLU of Massachusetts in 2003. Carol?
Sure. Hi, would you like me to use the microphone? The microphone? Yeah. Okay. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great, wonderful. It's so nice to be here, everybody. Thank you, Gohan. The ACLU is almost 100 years old, and we've worked on a range of civil rights and civil liberties issues during that time, but underpinning much of what we do is thinking about religious liberty, freedom from religion, as well as freedom of religion. And of course, as you all know, there's a close relationship between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Because if we allow the government to establish any one religion, they may use it to prevent other people from exercising their freedom of religion. So the two are closely related, and the ACLU's long worked on both of them. One of my favorite stories about an ACLU case on religious liberty took place actually at the ACLU. We have an office in all 50 states. And it took place in Rhode Island years ago, where there was a mayor of Rhode Island, Buddy Cianci. Does anybody remember? So Buddy Cianci, right, he went on to go to jail for corruption and then became a right-wing radio talk show host. And kind of typical career path. So he put the a creche on his town hall in Providence, Rhode Island, and he was the mayor down there, and so the local ACLU affiliate sued him and made him take the creche away. And he said, yeah, the ACLU is just mad because they can't find 3 wise men or a virgin in the entire organization. So I'm here tonight to say that's not true. Just saying. No more comment on that. So we're at a really interesting and scary time. So what's at stake is really the future of our democracy and our liberty at this moment for a whole range of reasons. But underpinning so much of what we're up against right now is the danger that the government right now is embracing religion and sort of attempting to bring down the wall between the separation of church and state. And I'm going to talk about a couple of themes that I see occurring right now in that. But one of the things to think about is with the Judge Kavanaugh. So the ACLU did a study of all, an analysis, as we do of all people who are nominated to the Supreme Court to see what their holdings are. He doesn't have a lot of jurisprudence. He doesn't have a long history of writing specifically about separation of church and state, but what he has is not good. And so, in a couple of recent cases, he, in speeches also, he raised some pretty scary things. One of the things that he raised was in the case called, I think it was Priest for Life case versus HHS, also known as the Little Sisters of the Poor case. And that was a case where under the Affordable Care Act, if there was a reason that a provider didn't want to have insurance companies provide contraceptive coverage or abortion services for their employees, they had to check a box saying that they had a religious reason not to do that. And the Little Sisters of the Poor claimed that this was an undue burden to have to check the box. And so the ACLU and others took up that case, and while we won the case, Judge Kavanaugh issued a pretty blistering dissent, saying that he thought this was an undue burden to have to check the box, and he would have gone the other way. So that's one of the cases that we know is a problem. The other sort of evidence that we have about where Judge Kavanaugh might be if he goes up to the highest court in the land is a speech that he gave recently where he talked about his mentor, Justice Rehnquist, who had been on the court before, obviously, and that he really agreed with the comment that Justice Rehnquist made that jurisprudence doesn't support the notion of a wall between church and state, and that in fact there is no wall between church and state. Now that wasn't a legal case that he ruled on, but nonetheless the fact that he said that in a speech is incredibly concerning. So if you haven't yet joined the Say No on Kavanaugh confirmation yet, it's not too late. You might have another 24 hours or so to do that. But the ACLU has come out against the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh. In contrary, we've only done that 4 times in our 98-year history. And so we're concerned about what's happening with him, and I'm happy to talk more about that if that's of interest to people. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I sort of see there's so much we could talk about, and we probably will, with people who have great expertise. I'm so honored to be here with my fellow panelists. But I wanted to talk about 2 different areas that I see on religious liberty that are really of concern right now. And one is the area of religious refusals. And that is really efforts to invoke religion to discriminate against other people who you don't like or who you don't agree with. And we're seeing this in 2 key areas. One area that we're seeing this is in the LGBTQ area, and the other is in reproductive justice and access to health care for women. Everybody probably heard about or knows about the Masterpiece Cake case, Masterpiece Cake Shop case. But our feeling is that nobody should be turned away from a business or refused service by the government or evicted from their home just because of who they are. And in June, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed that core principle that businesses that are open to the public have to be open to everyone. Okay, and just to remind everybody, in the public accommodations law, the right to access something that's open to the public, that goes back to the lunch counters and the civil rights movement, right? And those who either read history or remember it, know that there were people who attempted to invoke religion to say, I don't believe that black people or white people should be allowed to sit together or to be together as a religious matter, right? And that was overruled by our courts. And so again, this is sort of coming up now in the context of LGBTQ people. The court didn't accept the argument, but they did it on a technicality. So the lower court ruled, so we won in the lower court, which said that, yeah, you can't discriminate, that's wrong. But the court overturned the lower court, not because they said you can discriminate, but because they said that the lower commission that had looked at it had said prejudicial things. Said things like these are crazy people, stuff like that about people who wanted to discriminate. And so the case was resolved in a good way in the sense that in a bad way in some ways and in a good way in some ways, but mostly it just remains open. So there's a new case that's now been filed against in Colorado again. The same plaintiff has gone back, and this time I think they're saying they want to take pictures. Because before, when you talk about creating a cake, that's, is that artistic expression or not? given that he didn't even ask them what they wanted on the cake. He just said, "Oh, you're gay, I'm not going to serve you." The facts are kind of clear that it wasn't articulate. It's a little bit different if you say somebody who's a photographer, like a wedding photographer, would have to go and take pictures. So that case is going to challenge it once again. And I'm very concerned again that if Judge Kavanaugh becomes Justice Kavanaugh, there's a likelihood that the U.S. Supreme Court will rule that people can invoke their own religion to discriminate against other people in public accommodations. So that's really a scary set of cases, and I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to it. Another place where I was saying where this has come up is in the reproductive rights case. And so we're seeing a lot of places where religion is being invoked to discriminate against women in healthcare. Hospitals and pharmacies are discriminating on basic care, such as access to birth control or emergency contraception or abortion or tubal ligations, all in the name of religion. You know, we had a lot of consolidations of hospitals here in Massachusetts under Stewart hospitals, and those are religious or Catholic hospitals, and we're getting reports of women who are going in. We had one case where a woman went in, she had her fourth child, and she didn't want to get pregnant anymore. And so she said to her doctor she wanted a tubal ligation after her fourth pregnancy. She thought there was no problem. But then after she got into the hospital and she was there, her doctors informed her that they wouldn't do the tubal ligation because it was against their religion. And so we're seeing cases like that where people are invoking religion to discriminate against people who just have different viewpoints than them on things like access to reproductive health care or being gay. A couple years ago, the ACLU of Massachusetts, we sued the Department of Health and Human Services because they permitted the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to use taxpayer money to impose religious-based restrictions on abortion and contraceptive access for people who are victims of human trafficking. So what happened is Health and Human Services had a grant that they were giving away here in Massachusetts for about $3 million annually to give it to organizations that are providing health care for victims of human trafficking. And the HHS gave it to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, even though the bishops said, we're not going to give this money to any healthcare agency that actually provides access to contraception or any kind of reproductive health care, even though many, many victims of human trafficking are also survivors of sexual assault and abuse, right? Who are people who very much may need access to that kind of health care. So the ACLU sued them and sued the government and said, you're not allowed to do that. You can't give that to people. And it was interesting because initially we thought the case was going to go away because it started under the Bush administration. And then when Obama got elected, we were like, oh, that's going to resolve it, right? The case is going to go away. And Obama's people told us, well, when we have to take our chances between fighting the ACLU and fighting the Catholic Church, I guess we'll fight the ACLU. Wrong choice. So we won the ruling in the lower court. And then at that point, the Obama administration backed down and took the authority away from the Catholic bishops to be able to give the money away. And then it was kind of an odd situation because the ACLU was in arguing. And so the Catholic bishop said, okay, the case is moot because we don't have the money anymore. So the case is no longer a right case for the court to consider. And we said, yes, Your Honor, but they could do it again. Like if you kick the case out of court, the next administration, imagine like a Trump administration could come in and do the same thing and give the money away. And then the Catholic bishops came in and said, yeah, just imagine another administration. They would give us the money to do it again. So we were on the same side as the Catholic bishops arguing that the court should make a decision. And we both lost. And the court decided not to ultimately make a decision because the case was no longer right. But I suspect that will be coming back as an issue here in Massachusetts that we'll be having to fight. So that's going to be a really scary thing that we have to pay attention to. So in addition to sort of using religion to discriminate against people, the other area that we're kind of running into is discrimination against people because of their religion, and most notably since 9/11, but particularly since the Trump administration, we're seeing discrimination against people because they're Muslim in this country. And we're seeing that in the immigration context, the Muslim travel ban, right? One of the big arguments that we made was that the government was targeting people because of their religion and belief, and saying that people who have a certain religious belief are dangerous compared to people who have a different religious belief, which is, of course, nuts. And while we ultimately didn't win at the highest levels of the court, we did manage to force them to push back and to not try to make it be a religious argument anymore. And we also won time for thousands and thousands of families to be reunited. So the ACLU, we brought this first case that invoked religious liberty, or for freedom from religion and religious liberty in Massachusetts. We got the first injunction nationwide, and then ultimately it was in Hawaii that the case that went up to the Supreme Court was argued. But we had a dozen cases around that. The other thing that's happening, and I don't know if you all have heard about it, but I hope you'll tell people that you know, is something called a program called Countering Violent Extremism. This was a program that's coming out of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. What it is, it's a grant, and Boston is one of 3 cities that's a pilot for this program. The other 2 cities are Los Angeles and Minneapolis. And basically what they're doing is they're giving a huge amount of money to to people in human services, teachers, social workers, counselors, healthcare providers, and saying in a really unscientific way, here are people who we think might become extremists, people who are loners, people who are maybe disaffected from their religion, people who fit certain profiles. We always laugh when we talk about profiling. It's like, they always say in these profiling things, be really careful, and somebody could be dangerous if they won't look you in the eye, but they could be really dangerous if they do look you in the eye. It's like, what the heck? This is nonsense. This is garbage science. It's been disproven time and time again. Nonetheless, they're rolling this out to teachers and social workers and counselors and everything else, particularly targeting youth, and also targeting, in Massachusetts, we're noticing there's a lot of targeting in the Somali community. And the idea is that if you're a social worker or a teacher or whatever, and you see somebody and you think they fit that description of a potential person who might be, who isn't an extremist, but might be vulnerable to becoming one, you report them to the Department of Homeland Security, and they get tracked. So it's a predictive policing approach, and it's really, really dangerous. And so we're working with other groups and coalitions to try to, first of all, alert people that this is happening, to let people know that if it is happening and you hear about it, we want to hear about it because we want to challenge it in court. So if you hear about this happening, please let us know. And also to educate the social workers and the teachers. And we don't have all the money the government does to, we can't compete with them. But to let people know that this is really bad science, and that it's not the way to go. And again, targeting people based on their religion or their lack of religion, it's not only unconstitutional, it's also dangerous. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and having a conversation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ron.
Just going to.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We're also very proud to have with us Ronal Madnick. Ron is the president of the Massachusetts chapter of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State since 2006, and is a member of the AU Board of Trustees. He was a recipient of the Eleanor Hawley Award from the Human Rights Commission of the City of Worcester in honor of his lifetime commitment to human rights work, and he was voted Best Freedom Fighter by the editors of the Worcester Phoenix. He hosts a semi-monthly half-hour show, Civil Liberties with Ron Madnick, Know Your Rights, on Worcester Public Access. Ron?
Thank you. First, I'm a former teacher, by the way, for 34 years, so of course I brought a lot of materials with me. Before I go any further, I've done just 300 half-hour television shows. And what I did is I took out of those shows about 45 of them on the issue of church-state. They're all on the internet. This tells you how to see them. They go all the way from let them eat cake to being silent at certain events. So if you'd like to read more about them, they're right there. Go to the internet or go to and you can see them. The other thing I have passed out is an article called Massachusetts Mistakes. It's about a lawsuit here in Massachusetts that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Another article which I have, we have chapters all over the country. This tells you how to belong to a chapter. Please help yourself. There are materials here, there are materials over there. If you wish to join, there's a form for that. We have an envelope also. If you'd like to know more about separation of church and state, The U.S. Constitution mandates it. Americans believe in it. We have a handout on that. We also have another on religion in the public schools, which is still a very big issue. Another on the organization. Another on church-state, by fighting to keep church and state separate. We're fighting for freedom for everyone. We hope you'll join. We have that. We also have gay and lesbian, bisexual rights. We have that as well. I'm almost done. We also have another private school vouchers. And then just to be current, we also put out a magazine 11 times a year. And you notice this one's somewhat being talked about in the United States today. It's about the justice who would like to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. If you want to know more about him, there's a magazine that you can also read. That's available on the table over there. Okay, now what I want to do right now, I want to talk from personal experiences to show where we were and where we are now. I'm now 81 years old. When I was going to elementary school back in the 1940s, Oxford Street Elementary School, which my brother went to, and my other brother, back in those days, we always began the day by reading the Bible. And we always said the Lord's Prayer. And one day in the second grade in the 1940s, I sat up and I looked around the room and I saw the teacher had her head bowed. And all the students had their heads bowed. And they were all saying the Lord's Prayer. I looked around and I thought there'd be a stroke of lightning from above that would strike me. Nothing happened. That's when I became a secular humanist, when I was about 7 or 8 years old. Fast forward. In the 1960s, I began teaching at Chandler Junior High School. And we began every day having to read a passage from the Bible. And I thought to myself, this is wonderful, because on their time, I can read the Bible from the first page to the last by the time I retire. I thought that was great. What did I know back then? About 2 years later, I had to stop because of a man by the name of Ellery Shemp. And I'll talk more about him later on, but get to the bottom line right away. Where he went to school, they had to read from the Bible. They never said which Bible. So one day he brought in the Quran. And this led to a big fight in the school about which Bible to use. That case ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now this is a high school student raising an issue that goes to the Supreme Court of the United States. It not only shows you what one person can do, it shows you what one young person can do. I had to stop my reading at that time. I was very much disappointed. I met Ellery years later. I'll talk about him in a minute, a statement that he made. We're good friends nowadays. So much for the public schools, but I'm not done. When I first began working for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, there's some dispute over this, I think, but I know the year. It was 1981. How do I know? Because in that year, all I did was church-state issues. I knew nothing about Americans United for the separation of church and state. What are some of the things that I did? In Newton Square, they used to put up a menorah. And it was put up by the fire department. And so I spoke to the old city manager, this may be 30 years ago or more, and I said, you cannot use city equipment for this purpose. They agreed they would not, and this square would be open to everyone, which is fine. Religious and non-religious, fine. Fast forward about 30 years. There's a new city manager. He didn't know about the agreement. So one day I'm driving by, and what do I see? I see a menorah up at Newton Square. So I call him on the phone, and I said, you may not realize, but your predecessor, City Francis McGrath, has an agreement with us. And, oh, sorry, I didn't know that. That was the last year that happened. So, and then another thing, just to show you where things were coming. The city of Worcester rented classroom space from a former parochial school, which was across the street from the public school. And I went into that classroom. What did I see? I saw crucifixes on the wall. This is a public school. with crucifixes on the wall, and not everybody there was a Protestant or a Catholic. And so I raised that with the superintendent. They were all taken down. And then a Jewish a Jewish lawyer came to me. He was Orthodox. What was his complaint? He went into a courtroom, and there were religious symbols in the courtroom. Now, the last thing we want to do is go to court. It's expensive, it takes time, you never know the results. You want to do things that you can control. So I wrote to the chief administrative judge of Massachusetts, and I said, this should not be allowed. He said, thank you. He sent a letter to all the judges in Massachusetts, telling them this is not allowed in the courtroom. I first tried to get the judge to do it on his own. When he wouldn't do it, I went to the person in charge of all the courts in the state, and he issued that, and we have not had a problem in that ever since. So some strange things have happened in the past that don't happen anymore. Now, let's get to churches today. A lot of states have what's called an anti-aid amendment. It's usually an amendment to the state constitution. We have that in Massachusetts. It was put in, I believe, the year was 1917. What it simply says, to get to the bottom line, you cannot give government money to an active church. Why? Because people perhaps don't belong to it or don't believe in it. Why should taxpayers' money go to an active church? If the church needs money, they should raise it from their own congregation. Or do what Temple Emmanuel did, share it with another religious group, or sell it to somebody who should use it. But you shouldn't expect the taxpayers to pay for it. And so what happened, I found out, we got a person in Acton, Massachusetts contacted me. And he was opposed to the fact that under the Community Preservation Act, now the Community Preservation Act was passed in 2000. What it allows a city or town or whatever to have a new tax, up to 3% voted on, and that money would be set aside to restore historic buildings, including churches. But there's an amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution that says you're not allowed to give taxpayers' money to an active church. So one person called. So we decided to file what's called a 10 taxpayer lawsuit. So I had to find 9 more people. The first 12 people I called up all said yes. I only needed 10. I had 13. I obviously could have had a lot more. It went to court. This is Americans United, the separation of church and state. The judge ruled against us. And of course we appealed. Now usually it goes to the appeals court, but not in this case. In this case, it went right to the highest court in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. And what that court did, it issued directions. And it said, take it back to the lower court, and the lower court should look at it based upon the instructions or directions that the SJC is giving. Well, what happened is it was clear that if you follow those instructions, we're going to win. So what happened in Acton? The churches that wanted the money withdrew. They decided, after all, they did not need the money. Now that made the case moot, which bothers me because suppose they try it again a few years from now. But never fear. We found out that Boston is now trying the same thing. There are 9 grants that Boston has approved under the Community Preservation Act for active churches. So we do what we always do. First, we send a letter written by a team of lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so I always translate whatever the lawyers write. That's one of my jobs. And basically what happened, we said it's wrong, and we asked you to reconsider. And we're waiting to hear from the mayor of Boston and others. If we can resolve it that way, fine. If we can't, we go back to court. But we're much further ahead because of the Acton case. The Acton case was the same issue. The highest court already ruled on it. The highest court already gave instructions to the lower court. So if this goes to court, the court who has to deal with it already has in place instructions from the highest court in Massachusetts how to handle this kind of issue. So it's not as though we're back to, we claim victory, and they also claim victory, by the way, But we think we won that case, the fact that they decided they did not need the money after all. So very quickly, another thing, and this is, I mention this because Joseph Kennedy III, your congressman, has filed a bill in the House of Representatives with another congressman, and it's called Do No Harm. It has to do with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed years ago when Indians were using peyote. And because they were using peyote, which was a drug, the government was going after them. But the argument was this is part of their religion. And that case was won at that particular time. So the law that was passed way back then was to protect things like that. Now it's being used to attack religious freedom. And so they have filed in the Congress of the United States the bill Do No Harm, which makes it very clear that you cannot take away certain rights. Like people have the right to be free from discrimination if they're a woman, if they're trans, whatever, same-sex marriage, whatever the case might be. Everybody has those rights, and you should not be able to use your religious beliefs to override those rights. Carol's already mentioned the cake case. That's why one of the cases I have, it says, let them eat cake. It's about that. And that was also a 5-4 decision, I believe. So a lot of the decisions are 5-4, and that is the problem. Because Judge Kennedy is no longer on the court. He was good in some ways and not good in others. What is the 5-4? What was it? What is it today? Because today we only have 8 judges, right? 4 judges that rule for the separation of church and state. 4 of them. 3 are women. That's interesting. The 4 who want to tear down the wall, they're all men. The ones who want to take away a woman's reproductive freedom, they're all men. The ones who are opposed to that are the 3 out of the 4 who are women, which is very, very interesting indeed. Now, what's the danger? And if I go on too long, stop me. I've been doing this more than 50 years, okay? I could go on for days. But let me just give you one more example of the danger of this. We represent a woman who wants contraception. She doesn't want contraception for birth control. She wants it for a medical reason. That's not that one. And that's her privacy issue. If they say you cannot have contraceptives because they think that a woman is using that not to get pregnant, they're denying this woman the same thing for a medical reason, which is certainly not the case here. One more example, representing a woman who is not opposed to having children. She just doesn't want to have them right now. She wants to have them later, and she's being opposed too. I think you might have mentioned Notre Dame University already. But at any rate, there are some cases on Notre Dame University. It has to do with 17,000 people. They are denied certain health care. We are fighting that in the courts. I want to close with one more thing because part of this is where do we go from here? As I am here at this moment, Notre Dame Church in Worcester, which really was for French Catholics, is being torn down. Mount Carmel, mainly in the Catholic part of the city, right as I speak, is being torn down. Why? They cannot afford to maintain it. The congregation has gotten too small. They're beautiful churches. They're historic. They are coming down. Temple Emmanuel, where I went to school, where I taught, where I got married, used to have 1,400 families. What's happened? They had to merge with Temple Sinai. What do the two have together? Less than 400 families. So I know about some of the Catholic churches personally. I know about some of the Jewish personally. I'm not that familiar with Protestant groups, I have to admit. That is coming down. And Temple Emmanuel was sold to Worcester State University across the street because Temple Emmanuel had a big space, already had classrooms in it. But the other 2 buildings could not be converted for that purpose. That is life. That is the way it goes. But what does that mean for the future? It means that as the congregations shrink in size, as the money they can raise, not all of them, shrink in size, where are they going to look to maintain themselves? They're going to look more and more to government aid. They're going to look more and more for taxpayers' money. I have to tell you, in the case of Acton, Massachusetts, this has been going on for about 20 years. We're the first ones to challenge that. There are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. Already more than 100 are asking for that money. There are almost half the states have anti-aid amendments in their constitution. And even though this is in state court, you can believe that if there's challenges in other states to this, they're going to use what's developed in Massachusetts to help win those cases. So we see what we do, not just in this state, but has ramifications for other states as well. I'm going to stop there with, again, just one last reminder. Sometimes one person can bring an issue that no one else has brought before to the courts, can end up in the U.S. Supreme Court in a ruling that can affect all the public schools in the United States. Ellery Shemp was one of those. I'm going to take one more moment because Ellery did write something which I think is worth repeating, and then I'm going to stop. Here's what Ellery said in 2013. What provision? I'm going to get to right there. The Bible is not the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. The Bible never once mentions freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to vote. Even the Declaration of Independence fails to mention the Bible. The changes to our laws is not necessary. Aspects of the Bible can be taught presently in history classes, literature classes, even in science classes, in contrast with methodical evidence-based science. And then just one more thing which has to do with secular humanism, let me say. The notion of public prayer before council meetings is itself rather weird. A theological religious notion that praying somehow leads to better government, or that some supernatural entity will show favoritism to get better roads in communities that pray. This is naked superstition, a bow to witchcraft, an acceptance of magical thinking, like school kids praying before an exam. Better to have read the assignment and done the homework. This is Ellery Shemp, who brought that case to the U.S. Supreme Court, who ended Bible reading in the public schools. And he goes on, it's also rather weird to imagine that clergy who pay such and such have some insight that others do not have. Clergy, of course, are not elected and have their agenda, continuing income from their congregations. City councilors have an agenda to get reelected by doing good for their community. There's a difference.
I'm sorry, Ron.
Let me stop there. I'm sorry. Ellery goes on to explain how ridiculous it is to think that heaven's going to intervene at the next city council meeting in the city of Worcester. That's the bottom line. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ron. And last but not least, and essentially it's good that we ended on Ellery Shemp there because he's co-chair with our next panelist, Zachary Boss. Zachary Boss is he's co-chair with you, isn't he?
What's up?
He is co-chair with you, isn't he, of Secular Coalition? Yeah. So Zachary Boss is the co-chair and founding member of the Secular Coalition for America in Massachusetts, Secular Coalition of Massachusetts. He's a founding member of the Boston Coalition for Reason and the Sunday Assembly Boston, editor of Secular Age news site, and is a trustee of the Sunday Assembly America, and has been the American Atheist State Director for Massachusetts since 2008. He serves the community regularly as a fundraiser for secular causes and organizations, and as a citizen lobbyist, meets frequently with legislators in New England supporting legislation defending separation of church and state. Zachary?
Thank you. Please bear with me. I'm recovering from a cold. The first occasion for citizen lobbying that the Secular Coalition for Massachusetts was involved in actually came to our attention through Ron's work with AUMA, and that was back in 2013 for H382. A state rep had proposed a law that would mandate the teaching of Bible studies in public schools, and we thought that wasn't right. And that was our trial run in trying to mobilize enough supporters of secular membership and community and social and congregational groups in Massachusetts so we could hit some sort of a number of Massachusetts residents and Massachusetts voters that we could put down on a document and walk into a legislator's office and say, hi, we're here on behalf of 10,000 people, and these 10,000 people think that you should vote down this bill. And we didn't hit 10,000, I think we hit 500. And that bill did not make it out of session, which we were glad for, but it was an education. I come to this work not as someone who has a legal education, but as a community organizer. And so I am very glad to follow the lead of organizations like Americans United and ACLU, groups like Free Speech for People out of Newton, which is concerned with constitutional and civil rights, groups like Compassionate Choices, which is concerned with death with dignity, and of course the Equal Marriage Movement and various groups that support that. They come up with the legal strategies, they come up with the legislative agenda, and then we as a coalition partner and an ally muster our resources, such as they are. And such as they are is actually the problem that I'm mostly concerned with. It's above my pay grade to worry about what laws are coming down from the federal side or from Beacon Hill. But in terms of providing support and getting secular identifying voters and residents off the bench and into the game, that's where we're trying to leverage our community size. Some estimates suggest that up to 30% of Boston residents are secular identifying voters, and yet we continually struggle to have anything like representative participation on lobby days or on actions like at Logan Airport when the first Muslim ban was announced. About a dozen atheists were there, I was among them, and we saw many people holding up signs that said Christians against the ban, Jews against the ban, and we didn't see many of our fellow travelers. I find that very problematic. There's no discontinuity between the struggle for equal rights across gender lines, across racial lines, and across belief lines. So our mandate in Secular Coalition for Massachusetts at this time is really to be engaged with movement building. We have significantly ramped down our public-facing activities. I don't think we've put out more than 2 press releases this year. Our social media accounts probably look moribund. The reason for this is we've decided the 24 or so people who are committed activists with it, and the 40 or so people that we poll for information about what our annual agenda should be. We decided that we should stop trying to build our boat while we're also floating in our boat. We're trying to slow down the public-facing side so that we can really line up our resources and be more effective. That said, we haven't stopped entirely. We did train people to go down to Washington, D.C. for a citizen lobby day. We sent 14 people down to Washington with training, with an agenda to speak to our elected representatives, and we largely subsidized their costs. On Women's March for D.C., we did fundraising to largely subsidize the costs for more than 30 people to participate in bus travel down there. A particular bill that we were involved in supporting this year was proposed by Representative Day of Stoneham. This was House Bill 767, and this was kind of exciting. It wasn't a peril so much as a product of our relative freedom from religious tyranny in Massachusetts. Folks, we're in Boston, and we're in Cambridge, we're in New England. There aren't that many theocratic dragons to slay. That gives us a little room to breathe, and we can be proactive instead of reactive. So 767 sought to close a loophole in the law that might have allowed coverage for a for-profit corporation to discriminate on religious grounds, a religious refusal. The reasoning behind it, coined by a lawyer by the name of Ron Fine, who works out of an office in Newton, this is the group Free Speech for People, this was his reasoning. If you are a for-profit corporation, you can't be an individual claiming a religious liberty. Instead, you are a distinct legal entity that is summoned into being only with the authorization of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Therefore, if you accept the rights and privileges of that distinct entity, predominant among them being limited liability, then you must also accept certain restrictions as the Commonwealth sees fit. And in this case, the Commonwealth would insist that you could not discriminate in terms of products and services, employees or customers on religious grounds. This bill was exciting enough to have come to the attention of the House Working Group. This was a committee of legislators, legislative leadership actually, that formed following Trump's election. And their mandate is to try to anticipate problems coming down the pipeline from the federal side so that Massachusetts can be prepared to neutralize those problems and protect our residents. So 767 was read in committee for the working group. And who was in the room? There were folks from Representative Day's office. There were folks from Free Speech for People. There were folks from the secular community. We had mustered some numbers and some money to support this. And there was a chair set aside for a staff attorney who was supposed to fly in from New York representing the Alliance Defending Freedom. This is where, this is an example I'd like to point to underscore the reason I emphasize the need for movement building. We're out-moneyed, we're outnumbered. The Alliance Defending Freedom is about a quarter century old. They're a legal advocacy group, they're a law firm, they've got hundreds of lawyers, hundreds more staff volunteers. Their annual financial throughput is something like $40 million. And I would say they're the number one force of Christian conservative legal activism. They're the folks who are out there pushing RFRA, defending RFRA. They're the folks out there who are facilitating the calling of cases to get advantageous judgments read into the books so that you've got all that precedent working against folks who believe in pluralism and secularism and who are against the privileging of any particular religious position. So it was a little imposing to think that our little club of secular humanist activists and atheist community organizers were facing down somebody from the ADF. That person ended up not coming because they had caught wind that the bill wouldn't make it off the House floor. It didn't. But we think Representative Day might be interested in reintroducing it in January. So when I went back and I reported to the Secular Coalition for America office in DC, I said, you know, the hearing had gone well, the testimony was very favorable, the atmosphere in the room was good. We didn't know at the time that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And she said, what did you make of the person from ADF? And I hadn't even heard that initialism before, I didn't recognize it. So it was this professional attorney who works for the Secular Coalition in DC who put things into scope for me. And that was very sobering. It was after that hearing for 767 this summer that I went back to our executive committee for Secular Coalition for Massachusetts and said, folks, we've spent about $4,000 on advocacy and citizen lobbying training, travel expenses, brochures, and leave behinds this year, $4,000. So we are facing folks that outscale us 10,000 to 1. Let's slow down a little bit. Let's stop worrying so much about meet me at the flagpole days on public schools. Let's stop worrying so much about creche displays and so on. There are good folks who are out there taking care of those issues. But if we really want to be serious about creating a movement and a network and a cultural sense of identity and solidarity among secular identifying community members and especially voters, we need to focus our attention on that. So that's a little something about our pivot. I will mention one more thing about an initiative that we've been involved with, especially this year. We do a lot of letter writing. We've written nearly 36 letters of support for persons who come to us that we know are active in the Massachusetts secular community as community members. You know, these are just our neighbors and our friends and our group fellow members. These are folks who are petitioning for a new or continued visa or asylum status in Massachusetts. And the reason they think to approach Secular Coalition for Massachusetts for a letter of support on our letterhead is because their countries of origin have blasphemy penalties on the books. And if they were to go back to Kuwait or Pakistan or other nations, Morocco, Egypt, they would be subject to incarceration, social or political censure, physical penalties, physical violence, and we don't think that's a good idea. So we write these letters, but on the legislative side, we have been discussing with persons with legal expertise, not commissioning lawyers yet, about a blasphemy divestment campaign. We'd like to find a sponsor for a bill in Massachusetts that would require any Massachusetts municipal investments, the policeman's retirement fund and so on, municipal bonds. They can't be backed by corporate investments in nations that have these blasphemy laws on the books. This is very analogous to the BDS movement, the divestment movement supporting Palestine. It's pretty ambitious. It's wildly above our current level of resources, but it's something that we feel compelled to try to pursue in the most preliminary way, because we've had individuals, again, neighbors, friends, lovers, coworkers, come to us asking for help because they might get deported and sent back to their homeland and jailed or murdered. That's a little bit about Secular Coalition for Massachusetts. We're not a membership organization, so if you have money to give, I hope you give it to one of the other 3 organizations represented. But if you have time to give, or if you're interested as a Massachusetts resident in somehow being plugged into real nuts and bolts activism as a citizen lobbyist, please feel free to talk to me afterwards.
Thanks, Zachary. I actually first met Zachary when we were both getting dusted with snow while putting up the banner in response to probably the first major church state concern, I think, since Trump got elected. I think there was the nativity scene. You've heard about this a little bit. So yeah, like how much more likely are we to see more such attempts made? For example, in Massachusetts or in New England?
Religious displays on municipal property and so on?
Yeah, are they likely to reattempt it? Have they been foiled forever?
Well, that particular display, someone is referring to the installation for 1 hour in the State House, in the Great Hall of the State House, of a Christian nativity display. Now this is traditionally not done. Right, the city of Boston permits the display of a nativity scene on Boston Common, as well as displays representing other philosophical persuasions, including that of secular Massachusetts community members. For the 4 of the past 7 years, we've put a banner out saying something like "Reasons, greetings," or "Happy holidays from your secular neighbors," something uplifting. 4 of the past 7 years, the banner has been destroyed or stolen quite quickly, but that's where it is. So why did Representative Jim Lyons of Andover fight so hard to put a second nativity scene less than 100 yards away from the official Boston display in the State House? Well, Representative Lyons was being backed by the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and they were trying to facilitate it. What they're trying to do is look for occasions where a suit can be brought for alleged discrimination on religious grounds. So even if the display was up for only an hour, if they were not given permission to do so, then that gives them standing to pursue a lawsuit. What they really want is to get as many occasions to bring cases that they think will be ruled favorably. And we frankly, the Secular Coalition doesn't have resources to fight that, but we can fight it with a public relations campaign, by putting beautiful people like ourselves out to charm viewers into thinking that maybe Representative Lyons is not on the up and up.
Very good.
We've actually dealt with this issue, and the way we resolved it is this, and the way the courts normally have resolved it. As long as the area is open to everyone, all religious groups and non-religious groups, anyone at all can use that space, we didn't see a problem. The problem comes when it's excluded to one religious group and others are not allowed, other groups are not allowed, and also government equipment is used to erect it. So we've worked out a compromise. They can have all the religious things they want as long as it's open to all other groups and there's no government funds involved.
Thanks, Ron. Carol, I noticed the ACLU Massachusetts has made a position known on No on 3 on the Massachusetts Family Institute.
Yes on 3.
As in a position
Yes
on No
on
on 3. Position is yes on 3. Yes.
Okay.
So how long has this been going on? What are maybe if you can comment on the specifics and what you're going to do?
Right. So Massachusetts is one of only 2 states, the other being Maine, that has ballots. So there's two ways to make a law in Massachusetts. One way to make a law is to pass a law to the legislature, and the other is to have a citizens ballot initiative. Okay, you get enough signatures and then you can change the law that way. So about 2 years ago, there was a bipartisan effort, which the ACLU was involved with along with other groups, to say that people who are transgender should have equal protection under the law. It was pretty straightforward. It was bipartisan, it was overwhelmingly passed, Governor Baker signed it. It wasn't actually that controversial. And mostly what it said is that in public places like restaurants and hotels and things like that, you can't discriminate against somebody simply because they're a transgender person. For those, how many people knew about that law? Like a couple? Yeah, I mean, for the most part, unless you're kind of politically engaged, most people didn't know that law was passed because equal protection for transgender people doesn't actually affect my life and many other people's lives. It affects transgender people's lives, right? Because they're not discriminated against. But for everybody else, it doesn't really make any difference. And there's been not a single report of any public safety problem because transgender people have equal rights in Massachusetts. Nonetheless, basically motivated by some of these same discriminatory and frankly often religious views, outside forces and the Mass Family Alliance, I think it is.
The Massachusetts Family Institute.
Massachusetts Family Institute, have come forward and they're putting to the ballot a ballot initiative, ballot number 3, that would repeal equal protection for transgender people in Massachusetts. And so we're urging people to vote yes on 3. And what's important about this is the first time in the country that there's been a popular vote or ballot initiative to take away transgender people's rights. So if we lose, it's going to be really devastating. So it's really important that if you're a voter, that you should be a voter, if you can be, and also tell other people to please vote yes on 3, just as a matter of common decency and equal rights.
Thanks, Sharon. Why do you think, though, that something like this is happening in Massachusetts? It doesn't seem very likely, one would think, given that this is sort of a liberal bastion generally.
I don't think it's a liberal bastion, actually. I know it feels that way sometimes, but I think that, Trump had a lot of supporters out where you guys live, out in central Massachusetts, and, I think that there's that combined with the fact that if you look in our state legislature, I think it's at least 90%, maybe more Catholic right now. And so there's kind of an interesting conservatism that I think that rolls through this state. And it also doesn't take a lot of people to get on the ballot. And then they get outside money from out of state once you get on the ballot. So I think the combination of the Catholic Church also preaching from the pulpit a lot, even though they're not supposed to, they do it. We've been seeing this in a couple of instances. There's also has been the last 2 sessions a push to try to get a ballot initiative to not allow poor women to get access to contraception and abortion, and again, coming from right-wing and out-of-state groups often, but religiously motivated groups often. The only good thing that happened is the last time they weren't able to get enough signatures because the Catholic Church was really busy because the Spotlight movie just came out. Yay!
What's interesting, I might have mentioned it, that contraception is not just used for birth control. As that my wife mentioned something much earlier on, of the menstrual cycle and so on. So if you deny contraceptives to people because of your religious beliefs, are you denying it to other people as well who have other medical conditions and really need use of it?
But even if they want to do it for birth control, they have a right to.
Yes, I agree. I'm just indicating that people who are pushing this in the religious community sometimes think it only applies in a very narrow way. It's much broader than they know.
These things can have ripple effects on others as well. So actually, that's interesting talking about people about preaching from the pulpit, because one of the first really breaches in was of this wall of separation between church and state was the attempts to rescind the Johnson Amendment, and that was quite concerning because given that churches are tax exempt and everything, and again you give a little, you take a little, so it does seem a bit strange though that they have they been waiting for this moment or something?
I think so, yeah. And so this would basically say that they're able to preach. They would, I mean, what they do now surreptitiously, you know, they would be able to do blatantly, which is to have a place where people can gather. We were talking about how hard it is to gather secularists together because we don't get
congregate.
together every Sunday, right, or Saturday, depending on, or Friday. And so what happens is if you have a religious reason to get people together and then you start to tell them how to vote or have, you know, what causes to support, that creates a political momentum where then you begin to sort of shift and you combine government and you move towards a theocracy. And that's obviously really dangerous, and that's what our founders didn't want to let happen, and that's why they put up the separation of church and state as an important wall between. But now we have this pressure that's coming from the executive branch of government, we see it happening in the legislative branch of government, and depending on what happens with this and subsequent nominations, we have a real danger that it could be happening in the judicial branch. You know, and so, you know, the question then is, you know, where do we invest our scarce resources in advocacy? I'm thinking pitchforks, but, you know, there could be other alternatives. But for now, we're still challenging them and being fairly successful in the courts.
Ron, you mentioned about the case of Act in Massachusetts and the money being used to restore church buildings. That actually reminded me of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the recent relaxation of prohibitions against using state money to restore churches or church property. Would you please comment on that?
You raise a very interesting issue, and I don't know if that's really been discussed in any court at this time. If it's a church that's a historic church and it's used as a museum, or you know, it's used by it's a church, but the people who use the church are not religious, there's no problem, of course, there. The problem would be if government money's involved. So I really don't have an answer to that one. I don't know if the courts have even taken that up yet, or will take it up. So that's all I can say on that.
I'm not aware of any attempt of the court to take it up, but shouldn't, I mean, wouldn't this be like the first thing someone might challenge? I mean, it just seems like it hasn't really been challenged significantly.
Well, it's interesting because you hear this all the time. And by the way, the courts use this quite often to justify a ruling. They'll say, well, this is tradition. This has been going on for 30 or 40 years, so it's fine. But as we know, a lot of things go on 30 or 40 years, and sometimes only takes one person to stand up after all that time to bring it to an end. But I hear courts saying that all the time. Oh, it's just tradition, or church state, having somebody give a prayer before the start of the city council, the school committee. We've done that for 100 years. What's the big deal? And they use that to dodge facing the real issue.
Can I get back to the issue of the pitchforks? Just the
Always.
close-up, because it's obviously the elephant in the room. Whatever we do locally is going to be usually overshadowed by what happens at the national level now. And it's a dramatic moment of kind of everything's being put on the table on one side. And I don't think it's the case we don't have the numbers. I think clearly the majority is opposed to the direction we're going. The majority didn't even vote for Trump. And the majority clearly doesn't support Kavanaugh. The majority doesn't support women being abused. And like Trump mocked the woman yesterday. That's not the majority, but it's a clearly organized group of bullies. And I think a big part of it is the right-wing Christian evangelicals. I call them Christian fascists. And they're not even the majority of Christians, but they're the most organized, and they're on the rise. And there's a section of the elite in America that's promoting this. And I think, just to say my whole point, I think Trump is more their tool than actually leading them, and so there's a dangerous mix. And you know, Sinclair Lewis said, if fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and the cross.
We'll open for questions in a few minutes.
What's that?
So we'll open for questions in a few minutes.
But I think it's legitimate, but I think he makes a really important.
How do we get the majority actually to stop this? Because obviously the Democrats are not putting a lot on the line to stop it, but the numbers are there to get the people to do something.
Right, I agree with you, and I do think that, if I might, I do think that a lot is going to hinge on these midterm elections, because I think that that's going to get the momentum going in one direction or the other. I think that and the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization, but I also, we're paying attention to what's happening, and I think that if we fail, if all three branches of the federal government become captured by one party or one movement, that's really dangerous. I do think one of the things that will happen is the action is going to move, and already has moved to the states. There's a lot of things that we can do in the state legislature where you can actually pass local laws to make protection. The state can be more protective of people's rights, just not less protective under the supremacy clause. So I think there's a lot of action and required activity, requiring us to be really creative to think about things that we can do, whether we're talking about religious liberty and freedom from religion, but also thinking in terms of reproductive access and health care. We can do a lot with regard to net neutrality. We can do a lot with regard to privacy issues, equal protection. And we were able to get equal marriage in Massachusetts before we had it anywhere else, right? Because you could have more protection in the states than at the federal level. So I hear what you're saying, but from my point of view, partly because I sort of feel like despair is not an option, that if in fact things start to go in the other direction, we have to really double down with the action in the states, and to be doing more state coordination, as well as challenging the gerrymandering, which the ACLU has been doing, challenging gerrymandering, not only on traditional gerrymandering grounds, but also on partisanship grounds.
So this is something that happens in Massachusetts, gerrymandering?
Well, the gerrymandering everywhere. In Massachusetts, there's an interesting story about that because Stan Rosenberg, who former Senate president, actually led the efforts when we did the redistricting. And he did a great job, and it's one of the reasons I think we have not 100% great districts, but not as distorted as like you have in places like Texas. I mean, thinking about Texas, just as an example, the 5 big cities in Texas together all went blue, right? All of them went blue. Austin, Houston, Dallas, whatever the other ones are. San Antonio, I'm missing one. But what happened is they're all sliced up like pies. All the cities are sliced up like pies. So there's a sliver of blue and then a lot of red, and a sliver of blue and a lot of red, right? So it's the gerrymandering that's the problem. So what happens with the census that's coming up in 2020, what happens with the challenges that the ACLU and other groups have to gerrymandering are going to be very fundamental from a structural point of view as to whether or not we're going to lose control of our democracy.
I have a saying that if it's not in the press, it did not happen. And what's very interesting, the press just covered an event in Worcester. There were only 10 people at the event. They didn't mention it was small. They didn't mention how many people were there. So the people who didn't come, they could assume there were thousands of people. How did they know? But the main point is all the arguments, and it was by Chris Rovage of the ACLU. There's a nice, beautiful article in the newspaper that maybe 87,000 people read, but they never read there were only 10 people there. So they can assume that there's overwhelming support, and the room was full from wall to wall. That's why I do the TV shows. Through the media, educate people. But and even though 5 people show up, if the reporters show up, and it's on the front page of the newspaper, you're multiplying your impact by thousands. So that's a good way to get to people and then get them over to your side of the issues.
One other thing I just want to say, because we have an office in all 50 states of the ACLU, we're able to be pretty strategic. So for example, on the anti-Kavanaugh stuff that we're doing, there's a big media push, television media ad buy, and they're doing it in Maine, Alaska, Nebraska, West Virginia, and Colorado. So you may not be seeing it here in Massachusetts because our senators are already going to be opposed to Kavanaugh. And so part of it is to be really tactical. And I'm not making a push for you to give money to the ACLU, but you should know that if you're an ACLU member, if you give money to the ACLU, half of any money that you give goes to the national organization to fund those kinds of initiatives across the country. Because it is, on one hand, the action's in the states, but on the other hand, we have to be strategic and pick the states that we want the action to be in. So we're putting a lot of resources also for the elections. We're putting a lot of resources into Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, Texas, and other swing states. So we're trying to be as strategic as we can, and not just to think parochially.
And if you belong to AU, 10% of your membership comes back to Massachusetts.
So another thing, speaking of Kavanaugh, he seems to be in favor of school vouchers, the school voucher program. And it's also especially concerning when you consider that Betsy DeVos is also making kind of moves, definitely rhetoric in favor of school vouchers. So with the capture of both the administration as well as the judiciary, do you foresee that there's a serious danger for, there's already places that use school vouchers already, but expanding this program and reducing the restrictions on it?
Well, you know it when he says there's no such thing as a separation of church and state, though Roger Williams says there is. George Washington sent a letter to the Danbury congregation saying there is. There was a treaty we signed with Tripoli, believe it or not, in 1801, which says we are not a Christian country. It's right there. So, and he says there's no such thing as a separation of church and state. That was misinterpreted. It's not really a guide to anything. I think that one example alone is enough to worry people.
If folks in the audience aren't familiar with the explicitly theocratic ambitions of Betsy DeVos and the small circle of political and business leaders that she works with, it's all based in Holland, Michigan. It's a fascinating slice of American sociology, and it's pretty sobering. I will mention charter schools in Massachusetts. The first charter school that we had a complaint with, sometimes folks will come to SCMA and say, we're having issues of religious privileging in classrooms, public schools or charter schools. The first charter school that we had a problem with was Mystic Valley School, charter school in Malden, which rents property from the adjacent church. And so for a good part of the school day, the students are in facilities that are just saturated with religious imagery and so on. And they were very effective in scoffing off our letters and letters from our national office because they felt they had coverage under the state regulations governing charter schools. So it's not enough that charter schools lack accountability. It's not enough that charter schools have disfavorable outcomes for the students that go through them, but they're also trying to get coverage for their particular ideologies. And as a secular organization, we take a special beat with that.
And this is something that Kavanaugh again has been kind of pushing because he also is in favor of school prayer, as in school-led prayer. So that seems to be on the front.
Why is this so important? The bedrock of our democracy is the private schools. That's where we learn our history. That's where we meet with all different groups. That's where I first saw my people who were black, was in my elementary school. I'm Jewish. By the way, the first head of the organization in our history is a woman. It has to be Jewish. But the point being is that, and I'm getting to the age now I tend to forget halfway through what I'm talking about. But, it's the bedrock. So if you give money to charter schools, there's only so much money. You're taking money somewhat away from the pie, less money for the public schools, which is the bedrock of our democracy. If you go to a parochial school, quite often there may be other people than Catholics there, but most of them are Catholics. You go to one run by the Protestant, mostly Protestant. If there's a Jewish school, a religious school, almost everybody there is Jewish. There's no mixing of the groups. There's no getting to know each other. Public schools is the bedrock of our democracy. And that's why it's so important to make sure there is separation of church and state, especially when it comes to the schools.
On the subject of Kavanaugh again, and referencing judicial capture, and with reference to this gentleman's comment about we're not outnumbered, but we seem to be out-organized. Judge Kavanaugh is not the only threat to SCOTUS. Amy Coney Barrett, who is on the Court of Appeals of the Seventh Circuit, back in 2016, when she was going through hearings for her nomination to that position, then Senator Al Franken pointed out that the Blackstone Legal Fellowship, a summer institute run by the Alliance Defending Freedom, $40 million a year, the Blackstone Summer Institute Legal Fellowship that she taught constitutional law for, has been labeled by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. And her response, very blithely, was, well, that's controversial. So if Kavanaugh, their chosen man, doesn't make it through the process, they've got another one behind him and another one behind her. They've been playing the long game, and so if we think that we can muster logical arguments and sound rhetoric, that'll win. No, that won't win. Money and sacrifice and organizing is what we need to bring to the game.
Well, the Republicans took a gamble. Garland was the nominee for the Supreme Court. They did not even allow a hearing. What's interesting enough is they gambled that Trump would win, which nobody thought he would, or very few people thought he would. So Garland never got a hearing. He was put up by Obama. And the Republicans gambled on it, and they won, because they won the election. So now they're able to put up people that Obama never would have supported. Just some politics.
All right, thank you very much. And I'd like to invite questions from the audience. Okay, at the back.
So, you put me on the deer and the headlights. I'm still mesmerized by the difference between a cake and a video.
What?
Right, the difference in the Masterpiece Cake Shop. So what it comes down to is when you have rights in conflict, two constitutional rights, on one hand, the right to freedom of expression, right, both in the First Amendment, and the other is right to be free from discrimination. What they were arguing was that making a cake is an artistic endeavor, and then he made fancy cakes. And therefore, he couldn't be forced to make a fancy cake because he can't be forced to express himself in ways that he doesn't agree with. And that was the argument that the people who thought it was okay to discriminate against made. And on the facts of the case as it was brought before the court, he had discriminated against this couple before he even asked what kind of cake they wanted. Like, they could have come in and said, we just want your standard cake off the shelf, nothing fancy. And he said, I won't give you any kind of cake.
Oh, that's not true.
Well,
I'll get back to it in a minute. I'd like to go over this with you point by point.
okay, but he basically said, I'm not gonna give you a cake, okay? But they hadn't talked about what kind of cake he was gonna make. It becomes a more difficult case when you say, we want you to come and take photographs at our wedding. Because then you're asking somebody to come in and actually do something that arguably does involve more artistic engagement, artistic expression.
Why would you argue that video has any more artistic engagement?
Well, the ACLU wouldn't necessarily argue that. I'm saying what the other side would argue is that there's more engagement. You're forcing someone, it's kind of a compelled speech argument.
Why do you want to force anybody to do anything? There's so many cake shops. Go get it somewhere else.
Because the argument that on the other side is once you open up your shop to the public, right? Once you say, I'm a public shop, I'm gonna open it up to the public.
Once you're a video shop and you open up and you take pictures of anybody, you don't want to do anybody
Right.
to force.
I think that would be right. I mean, I think that's right. But once you open yourself up for a public accommodation, I'm here to serve, I'm a restaurant with a lunch counter. If I'm opening it up to the public, I can't say I won't serve black people. I can't say I won't serve gay people, because I'm open to the public.
But if you do videos, the photographs, you can say, I don't want to serve black.
I think, what I'm saying is I think they'll make that argument, and the court was a little bit receptive to the argument that making a cake is an artistic expression, but ultimately ruled against it on the grounds that they didn't get that far. They didn't even get to talk to him about making the cake. That was what the lower court found. I think if they go to a situation where that argument might get more traction, so I think it's a more dangerous situation, because I think that's going to become where the court, I think, is going to try to take a look at that. And they're likely, I won't agree with it, I'm just saying I think the court will give it more traction, since they did pay some attention to that. It sounds like this gentleman has some facts.
Staying with this case, what did you say the vote was on it?
In the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
I don't know what the.
It was 7-2.
Okay,
7-2. The only people that voted against it were Ginsburg and Sotomayor. So
okay,
it's a solid majority, including people that have hammered it.
right, but do you remember what the reasoning was?
Yeah, the reasoning was not what you're saying. They didn't go into that part of it. The reason was that the Colorado Human Rights Commission was prejudiced against religion. So that was,
Right.
they had hostile attitudes towards religion.
Right.
Which
That's
has
what
an
they're-
effect on what you're saying and what your organizations are. If you go too far in
Mhm.
attacking religion and interfering with religious freedom, then you
Right.
may be the ones that are actually,
Right.
interfering with people's individual rights.
Mhm. So I would say two
Decide
things.
question, a couple of points more.
Okay, I'm listening.
Okay, Phillips, the man that owned the bake shop,
Mhm.
said he would be perfectly willing for anybody that, of any sexual orientation, to come in the shop and buy a cake off the shelf and do whatever they wanted with it. But he was not himself going to bake a special cake for them which expressed an affirmation of their type of arrangements in their relationship, all right? So
Okay.
they could have gone into a shop, they could have sat there and drank coffee and ordered anything off the shelf. They could have bought a cake and decorated themselves and taken it to their wedding. But he was not going to participate in the wedding by making a special custom-made cake for them. He made that clear, and a lot of people didn't listen to him. And you have to listen to religious people and see what their objection is and on what grounds it is. Because the court, unlike some of you people, are listening, and that's why it was a 7-2 decision. It was not a 5-4 decision, all right? And finally, I will say, I think ACLU is making a big mistake by violating their long-term cardinal principle of endorsing or not endorsing legislative or judicial candidates. They went on record as opposing the nomination of Kavanaugh. If you or individuals within the ACL want to do that, that's fine. But you're losing your own objectivity and your own neutrality and your own impartiality by doing that, and you're taking a big risk. And I think your organization, which I used to support, is sliding into partisan politics too much. You may actually have your own 501c3 status question for that.
Great, thank you. May I respond?
Perfectly, I'm listening.
Great, wonderful, thank you. So first of all, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert, I didn't argue on the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. My understanding was that the court ruled primarily because they believed that the commission, I think first, because you have to go to a commission and then you go to the courts after that, the commission had been prejudiced. I think there's a lot of people who don't agree with that, but that's what the court ruled, and that's why they sent it back down. They didn't rule, in fact, that it's okay to discriminate against people. I actually disagree with you about the facts. I'm pretty sure that they didn't get to the point of talking about what kind of cake they wanted. They just said that they wanted to have a wedding cake made by the cake shop. And he said he wouldn't make a cake for them. So I think I understand that he's saying you can decorate it yourself. That's not what they wanted. And so that's not what his shop was offering to the public at large. So I think there is a little bit of a distinction there. And that's why the lower court ruled, in fact, that it was discriminatory for him to do that, and that he couldn't invoke religion to discriminate against gay people. In terms of the ACLU's position against Kavanaugh, I think it's important to understand that, so this is the 4th time the ACLU has come out against a Supreme Court justice. And I think it's really important to see the totality of the circumstances. It's not simply because there are allegations of sexual assault from a number of people that some would argue.
How about innocent until
Can I finish?
Where did that go?
I'm sorry, may I
How
finish?
about innocent until proven guilty?
May I
He's not
finish?
on trial, okay, I don't know how to answer that, but
May I finish? Thank you. So first of all, as a matter of due process, that only comes up in criminal trials, but even in those circumstances, when you have a credible allegation and you take testimony from both sides, in fact, there is a judgment made about whether there's credibility by one witness or another. But let's just say for purposes of argument that you don't believe Dr. Blasey Ford and you do believe Judge Kavanaugh and that this didn't happen, or it happened and it was somebody else. Let's say you accept that. I think that the ACLU partly made this decision, it was the National ACLU Board vote last Saturday, because he showed a distinctive lack of judicial temperament. He was highly partisan, he misled the court, there are a number of factual inaccuracies that he had under oath. I think he showed a distinct lack of judicial temperament. And I think it would be very difficult for anyone who he spoke so harshly against to be able to appear in front of him without him being required to recuse himself. So I actually think that it's less of a partisan move than it is a concern for the integrity of the judiciary. But I hear your concerns, and I'm happy to share those back with the national organization, because I think that there are a lot of people who are concerned that it's coming across from the messaging as too partisan, and I don't think it should be partisan. I think it actually goes to questions of his judicial temperament and the integrity of the U.S. Supreme Court.
If it's not partisan, how come you're not mentioning that Massachusetts We don't even have minority in a Senate to uphold governor's veto. We're not talking
I
about
think we
that.
should at least follow people raise their hands.
Yeah.
and
I'm sorry.
I did, I was asking the question.
Right.
We have already asked a question, thank you.
May I just confirm one thing? Carol Rose is an attorney. As I told you, maybe I didn't tell you, one of my jobs is to translate what attorneys have to say and what attorneys write, because it's all so technical. In the Supreme Court case, they did not rule on the issue. What they ruled is on a technicality. And they more or less said, if this case comes back to us under different conditions, we may rule differently. So Carol is quite correct in what she said. But there was something that came up about the judges had prejudged or something before the trial, before it was heard. They didn't really rule on the issue itself. They, because of this thing that had happened previous in the legal process, but they made it very clear that if it came back under different circumstances, they would look at it again, and they might come to a different conclusion.
Next question.
Thank you for taking the question. This relates in part to the exchange that we just heard about the ACLU. I'll preface it.
Can you speak up?
I'll preface it by saying that I'm a long-time supporter of the ACLU, but it's hard not to be a little bit discomforted by the Phillips case and how it was resolved. But what I would like to know is whether people, you, Ms. Rose, and anybody else, of course, here, has a perspective on whether justice was served. And there's a part of me, as much as I'm not about to be running a cake shop which refuses anybody, that's not the issue or anything like that, that says to me that's not the kind of case that the ACLU should have gotten into, as opposed to saying, another possibility would have been saying something like, to the plaintiffs, organize a boycott, make sure the community knows this guy is a dope, whatever. But if we think of the larger mission of the ACLU as serving justice, especially because litigation is super expensive, this might not have been the best way we should be spending our money. The thing I would ask, or sort of add some context to that, so I'd like people's opinions about that issue, is that it's not hard, as much as, again, I wouldn't be a cake owner and believing what I believe, a cake shop owner, it's not hard for me to see a little bit of Ellery Shemp in Jack Phillips, saying I have a really heartfelt belief in a certain thing. I'm being compelled to do something that conflicts with it, and I have a freedom to do that. And my concern about this, and I would think about it as a concern in terms of the future efficacy of the ACLU, and how it spends its money and advancing justice, is to hear that they're contemplating this photographer case, the same plaintiff. There's a part that would want to go to that plaintiff and say, get a life. If you don't like this photographer, tell everybody this photographer is a dope. Should not be served by, we had the boycotts in the 60s of the Woolworth's lunch counter. Those were boycotts. They were economic, and it hit those businesses in the pocket. Didn't go to court, at least there was more, of course it was legal, wranglings about it. But I would like, as a friend and fan of the ACLU and similar organizations, all three of which have been represented tonight, I kind of wonder about sometimes how we can best serve justice, and it's not clear to me that it's through legal means.
Well, I appreciate that. A couple of things. I mean, our client wasn't Mr. Phillips. He's on the other side. So
No, that's what I mean.
Right, and we're not pushing the next case.
Okay,
The
you
other
said
side.
the thing just came to you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no. The other side's pushing it. And I would just say that the big difference with Ellery Shemp was an individual who was being compelled to say a prayer at school. I think the difference here is when you open, and under the law, and it is a technical legal term, although I don't need a translation, thank you. When you open a shop and you open it to the public for public business, just like a lunch counter in the 1960s, when black people wanted to be served at lunch counters, there were a lot of people who said, I don't serve black people because it's against my religion to do so. So this case was really just the next step in the same principle and the same line of cases in the law that say once you open your business to the public, you can't discriminate against people because of who they are. That's not allowed. And you can't invoke religion to discriminate against black people, and you can't invoke religion to discriminate against gay people, and you can't invoke religion to discriminate against women. The courts have consistently said that since the civil rights movement. And I think the reason that the ACLU took that case is because they saw that this was really the next step in the civil rights movement, is to make sure that people don't try to invoke their religion to discriminate against other people based on their immutable characteristics as human beings.
I don't think, by the way, Shem and Phillips are carbon copies of one another, but it's hard not, in my opinion, to see some kind of.
But Shem didn't have a business that he was opening to the
No,
public.
but he had a heartfelt belief.
Yeah.
And your answer is the legal answer. I want the answer about justice.
I didn't mean to indicate that Carol needs a translator. What I meant is a lot of legal documents that I see are written in such a way that if you're specially trained, it's hard to understand them. So it's always best to translate into layman's form. Let me say, Ellery Shep, by the way, it was Bible reading in the schools. And what he did, I already mentioned, he brought in a Quran. That then raised the issue of which Bible is going to be read in the schools. And that led the case. And he was in a public school, he was a teenager, and went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it stopped Ron Madnick from reading the Bible in 1963 at Chandler Street Junior High School. So, Ellery's a good friend of mine too. So, anyway, that's some of the history of Ellery.
Zachary?
When I spoke with Ellery about this case, his response is such that he would not agree with your likening the two, which is neither here nor there. But to your point about making this an extrajudicial form of activism, let the community push back with boycotts, with placards, whatnot. I thought that as a society, we would look upon it as a sign of progress, that we have moved from the moment where we have to ask people to put their social relations with their neighbors, put their bodies in danger with this sort of direct activism. We've moved beyond that to a situation where we have institutions and professionals and organizations that can pursue safer and more civilized forms of the same outcome. That strikes me as an improved state of affairs.
It's a heck of a lot more expensive to go to court.
Yeah, but you can't let the majority, I mean, it's not popular, right? That's the difference between democracy and democracy is ensuring that every person gets a chance to vote, right? Liberty is making sure that the people who have the majority don't repress the people who are in the minority. So what if they couldn't get in their town in Colorado people to do the boycott? Like, I mean, it's hard to get people to support your rights. So I don't know what the political, I mean, I wish they would too, and that's why one of the things we do is integrated advocacy. We're not just in the courts, we're on the streets, we're in the legislature. But I do think that it's hard to sort of say, you as a discriminated against minority group should mobilize everybody to support you, because it may be really hard for them to do that. I just don't know what the circumstances of their situation is.
Bus riders. They succeeded. It's not a matter of.
There were all, yeah, but there was also an ACLU lawsuit.
Okay.
I mean, it's a both and, not an either or.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I agree with
The
you.
point is, the law is perhaps, as much as it's important, don't get me wrong, a very cumbersome tool to sometimes achieve justice.
That's true.
Very cumbersome.
Is Leanne?
And just a general question, more from Zachary, but also more generally about a general question, maybe more for Zachary, but or also generally. You were saying you pivoted towards not looking at specific causes, but maybe trying to increase the base, something like that. So I'm trying to just ask you, what do you envision as the path forward for all this? You know, it's interesting, as you say, there's no Sunday pulpit for secularists, and as we can see, there's a lot of division even between people who are supposedly on the same side, you might say. So how do you try to, what do you envision in terms of expanding, supporting, organizing, educating there? And how do you define what your niche is compared to, let's say, Move On or something? You know, it's kind of a stew of different organizations. How do you have the unity between people who generally have the same cause while the different groups are pursuing?
It's a complex ecology, and it's a challenge to navigate. I'll accept criticism of this characterization, but I would say that the Christian conservatism has a very narrow ideology. And when you have a narrow channel that you're pushing all of your resources through, you can do a lot of damage. You can make a lot of things happen. And however you want to characterize the forces opposing Christian conservatism, I would say they have a much broader surface, and so they're somewhat diluted, and there's a lot of complexity. It's hard to navigate all that. I don't want to give you my vision for a nationwide or international network of mutually interdependent and reciprocating secular and humanist and liberal and progressive organizations. But in Massachusetts, there's some low-hanging fruit that we can pick up. One of the things that we've been working on since we started in 2012 as a state chapter is identifying town and ward reps. This gives us a certain kind of well-distributed coverage. And so we've got about 25% of all the towns and wards in Massachusetts. I've got somebody who, on an annual basis, we call them and they re-up their agreement to serve as the local point of contact. If someone in their community reaches out to us or to one of the member organizations that is a signatory to the Secular Coalition for Massachusetts Charter, you tell me you're in Athol, all right, I'm going to point you to the person who's in Athol. So they get immediate face time, and that's a form of engagement. So we don't lose that energy and interest. We can begin to onboard it somehow.
The person to talk to as a person who's a member of the chapter?
That's right. They're the local rep for Secular Coalition for Massachusetts. We don't ask much of them. We don't ask them to drive into Boston or to Worcester on a regular basis to have board meetings or anything. They just agreed to be the local rep. And this is analogous to, say, in the Mormon church, you have local stakes and local bishops. And so you've got a distributed network of people who are committed to your organizational success. That kind of structure, internal structure, is something that has largely been lacking historically in secular organizations. The fact that we had to raise $2,000 a year to pay for our membership management software was a significant development goal, and we got that taken care of. And so now, for our 10,000 or so contact points, we're able to see who is active or responsive to our various calls for action on a quarterly basis. So when we go into legislative meetings, we can say, hi, we're here on behalf of 6,000 people, or we're here on behalf of 400 committed donors and voters in your district, and so on. This is just operational stuff. It's very back of the house, and it's very boring, but it does take time and investment, and we're generations behind Christian conservatism in doing this. I'll just reference one more point of comparison. The Blackstone Legal Fellowship, over its years of activity, has sent out something like 2,000 ideologically honed lawyers into their professions, into the world of advocacy, lobbying, into elected office, into the judiciary, into legal profession. This is a 9-week intensive legal and ideological training seminar. And there isn't anything like it to compare in the world of secular humanism, or even, I would say, progressivism. Nothing that works in the same level of scale and efficacy. And if I want to, give you a sense of vision, I say, whatever they're doing, but better and more ethically.
Well, let me say that one of the worst mistakes you can make is to go before a city council and say you represent a certain organization, but you don't live in that city. Right away, the wall goes up. Not sure it's state, but a wall goes up. Oh, they're outsiders. How dare they come in and tell us what to do? So what I do is I know the telephone numbers and the addresses of all AU members in Massachusetts. If I have an issue in a certain city or town, I call the members in that city or town. I have them come. They're taxpayers. They live there. They vote. I usually keep my mouth pretty much shut, and I let them carry it, and quite often that's far, far more effective. I mentioned the Acton case. We had one complaint. You want to bring a 10 taxpayer lawsuit. What are you going to do? Well, you call people who live in Acton, who pay taxes, and they become plaintiffs in the lawsuit. And now it's your fellow citizens who live in the same neighborhood that you live in and pay the taxes that you live are bringing the case forward. It's not so much Americans United any longer, it's the taxpayers in that town who are opposed to having money being spent on active churches. That's the best way to be successful.
Yes.
Why does my dollar bill here say, where was it? In God we trust. Why is it all over the place? I mean, why, and the coins, I've been in courts of law where I still had to put my hand on the Bible. Certainly, on and on, pledge allegiance to God, it's in the songs, etc. Why is that now a couple hundred years and it's still there?
Well, I love that one, because that was put in the pledge in 1954 to fight the Reds, the
Right.
communists
Right.
at that time. Actually, I think that has gone to court. In fact, David Neosi, who is the legal director of the American Humanists in Massachusetts,
And my neighbor.
and his neighbor, and lives in Fitchburg, 20 miles from me, he actually brought a case like that. I believe he did not succeed in that. So he did challenge it in court. I forgot why we did not win, but I remember it was brought to court, and the court ruled against us.
And the Secular Coalition for Massachusetts was responsible for organizing the large rally outside the Supreme Judiciary Court of Massachusetts. The answer is we're working on it.
Well, why is it so difficult? I mean, it's a total day by day, totally built-in, iconic, mimetic indoctrination of everybody. I mean, it's unbelievable. I can show you buildings in Boston, federal buildings that have it all over the place. State buildings.
Every time a paper bill comes into my possession, I do cross out God. And then I write in my own words so that it says, in each other we must trust.
And you're still alive.
I think, your question is really well taken, and I think one of the things that it's important to realize when we talk about the courts versus the politics, well, there really isn't a division. Judges are political creatures, and I think we've been seeing that in these hearings in the last few days. They were the product of the political parties and the political movements, and they themselves are part of it. So I think recognizing that it's a construct, that a lot of what we need to think about is taking it into our education system, taking it to the streets, taking it to the people directly. And to this gentleman's point, we can't be successful in the courts if we don't also integrate that with our work across. That's why, while the ACLU is known primarily for its work in the courts, we work in Congress and in legislatures. We have a field and mobilization department. We have a communications and public education department. And so we find that we can win when we are able to fire on all those cylinders, and especially when we can do it across more than one state at a time, a region, or something like that. And part of the reason we haven't done it on all these issues is resources. Because how many battles can we fight at one time, right? But I think the judges are very much a product of our society, and so I think part of it is to really focus on the next generation. And I actually, for one, have a lot of hope about the next generation. If we can survive the next 2 years and hopefully not have a subsequent 4 years, I think that there's a chance we can actually emerge a more resilient republic than we were going into the last 2 years, where people, someone else will defend my rights, someone else will take care of freedom for me. Well, that ain't gonna happen. We have to each do it, whether we're teachers or students or neighbors or whatever it is. It can't just be the lawyers doing it, and it can't be somebody else doing it for us. Every one of us, in whatever position we have, whatever our system of belief is, we need to rise up and demand that we stay true to our values and not to our fears. And I think that's a huge challenge. I guess I'm a pessimist who pretends to be an optimist because I'd rather be active and futile than to be passive. But I do think that I'm hopeful that we can do it and take on those kinds of issues. Because I think
Just a quick follow-on, is there any country in the world that's better in a secular sense than the United States? Or are we still at a freedom level, the best place going on earth? In Canada, I know Europe is much more secular than the United States. They never go to church there. The United States is one of the most religious countries. Obviously, you can go into the Middle East and find even more religious. But my question is there any place, whether it's a Scandinavian country, England, whatever, or Canada, that is more respectful of secular?
Maybe Japan. I'm trying to think
Oh,
about
they're
places like that.
really bad.
Yeah, are they bad? I don't know.
It's an excellent question. We're a domestic organization. I think we should get involved internationally because you see what happens in the Middle East. But we legislate, we litigate, we advocate, we publicize, and as a last resort, we go to court because it depends who the judges are. So sometimes it may be a case we should go to court on, but we're afraid if we do, we're going to lose, and that's going to make it even worse than it was before. But of course, sometimes even when you lose, you set it up for a later decision that may come down in your
I was just
favor.
reading an interesting article about how in the Nordic countries where you have a greater degree of secularism, the governments are actually subsidizing the religions. So it's a really interesting kind of a contradiction. Like the government's subsidizing the religion, but the people are more secular. Go figure.
Yeah, secularism is multidimensional, so are you referring to legislative and judicial barriers between church and state? Are you talking about homogeneity? Are you talking about structural support for pluralism and so on? I would just point you to two resources. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights last year published a big doorstop report on blasphemy rights and penalties worldwide. And the bibliography is interesting. An organization I work with in Massachusetts, Great House, also has a blasphemy heat map, which you can find online. The other resource I would point you to is the International Humanist and Ethical Union, which is based in the UK, and they have a lot of documentation on religious liberty, freedom of expression around the world.
And in the orange and green?
Oh, hi. First of all, I just want to say, really thank you for all your work you do. It's very hard work. I've done a lot of political stuff, activism, and it's extremely difficult. But there was Engel, Jean Vitale in the 60s, who tried to get God removed from the money. And at that time, we were fighting communism in China and Russia, so we lost. But I did have a question. It's kind of a real naive question, but I was hoping you might have an answer. I'm disturbed when a school or a church moves and they get to sell the property when they never pay taxes on it. And I thought, why should they be able to do that?
It's a great question. And I don't know the answer, but maybe one of these.
I'm not sure, my hearing, among other things, is going to my age, but maybe you're referring to this. Churches, of course, are tax exempt, but ministers are not.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a case in court in which the minister said, well, we should be tax exempt because we're religious people, and the court ruled, no. The exemption applies just to the church. It doesn't apply to the ministers, or the pastor, or the rabbi. That helps is any part of what you're asking, but it was very interesting that the court came down that way.
Well, like Emerson College.
Right.
They moved from Beacon Street and over, and they sold all that property and made all that money. Shouldn't they give the money to the city? That's just, you know what I mean? They're tax exempt,
Yeah.
so why should they now collect even more money? Millions and millions of dollars.
Institutions of higher education are a little interesting because the cities tend to view them as magnets for revenue generation, and so in many cases they will have arranged payments in lieu of taxation, pilot payments,
Yeah.
but it's never enough. Colleges tend to be bad municipal neighbors. But with regard to churches and taxation, a vocabulary gap has always been of interest to me. When I ask people to name for me the form of social institution wherein people who tend to live near one another gather together on a regular basis to explore questions of ultimate concern, I phrase it differently, but people say, well, that's a church. And I say, okay, but what if they're atheists? So does church also apply to persons whose ideology means that they profess belief in the non-existence of the divine? If that's the case, then under the same tax status, under the same tax filing, that churches can enjoy those structural benefits to support their community goings-on, secular congregations are able to come together. And there are several national and international initiatives of networks of secular congregations that enjoy the benefits that churches do, but presumably wouldn't be as objectionable ideologically to secular folks as maybe churches are. Sunday Assembly is one of them. Sunday Assembly has over 70 active sites worldwide. Oasis is another one. There are numerous things going on. So maybe in the same way that I pointed to taking a page out of the playbook of Christian conservatism in terms of our advocacy organizations, maybe the tax benefits that we've always been jealous of, we can simply come to enjoy for our own purposes. I don't know if that's the right answer, but it's another dimension.
Well, you raised I just answered the tax thing for a second, which is fascinating. All nonprofits have to file with the IRS. I believe it's a 990. Guess what? Only one group of nonprofits don't have to. Guess who they are?
Churches.
The religious groups. And that's one reason why they should not take government money. Because if they take government money, they can expect government control. And then they can expect maybe to have to fill out a 990, as all of us have to do.
Yeah, I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm also a Muslim. I'm in the middle. Well, mostly in support of refugees and people trying to get to become citizens in solidarity. But when a church has candles that you light, they really shouldn't put the price, because now that's taxable. You're supposed to put whatever donation you want. And they say $4, then they should be taxed.
Yeah, I mean, for us, for example, if we sell a T-shirt or something like that, we have to list it as other income, unrelated business income, and we do have to pay taxes on that.
Yes. Yeah.
So
The other thing is, if you're, what's the word you call it? The organizations get together that aren't religious?
Sunday.
Sunday Assembly is one.
Secular doesn't necessarily mean atheist.
Right, yeah.
And atheists shouldn't proselytize, because if they don't believe in anything, what are they getting out there with what do you believe in nothing? You know, it's like, what?
We could spend a long time talking about all the things this atheist believes in a very devout way. My wife is rolling her eyes behind you. She's like, he'll tell you about it.
I had a discussion with a rabbi. I said, Rabbi, I'm not really religious, even though I was the Brotherhood Man of the Year for my temple in 1999. I'm not really religious, but I do actually believe that everyone I've known before I will see again. It's not logical, it's not religious, it's just a belief I happen to have. And the rabbi said, that's a discussion for another day, which we never had.
All right, my final words will be a joke I heard that I thought was kind of funny. What happens when you cross a secular humanist with a Jehovah's Witness? Somebody knocks on your door and says, why am I here?
So I want to thank our panelists. Well, we don't have any ACLU shirts. We do have some. We have 4 free T-shirts. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and secular. We have a T-shirt from Secular Voters. Secular Votes America. And we also have a bunch of paraphernalia from all these organizations, as well as some foreign paraphernalia. So please help yourselves to the table, to the contents of the table over there. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.